one of the bigger visual effects shots, the monastery that Dr. Parnassus meets the devil in, involves an awful lot of different techniques. I was maybe going to sort of talk you through some of the complexity that we went through to make it work. Obviously, like the whole movie, it started in Terry's head, and he came up with a storyboard that basically was quite different in a lot of ways than it came out. Originally we went in through a snowball and went into the snow flurries, met Mr. Nick riding his horse, and then up to the monastery itself. From here on it's pretty much identical to what we ended up doing in the movie. And Terry's original sketch, which is probably 2.5 years old now, is not far off what we ended up sort of making. This was something Terry put together in the very, very early days, one of the first visuals that got the whole style of the sort of ancient monastery at the foot of the cliff, etc., etc.
I think Terry had a very good presentation of what it looked like, and it looked very timeless. This kind of city on a horizon in this kind of Bruegel-esque landscape. But that's something that I looked at and thought, well, we're not really revealing it here, are we? You know, it's got timelessness, but is it dramatic in a cinematic way? So I think I took it home over the weekend and thought, I wonder, and and did some drawings and came back in with that stuff. And Terry said, well, yeah, okay.
And we also had to make sure that it tied in on the interior with what was going on in the next scene. In the next scene, Parnassus meets the devil, and there's hundreds of monks on flying carpets floating around. And geographically, the exterior of the monastery had to look like that could fit inside. So we'd actually built, or set up plans and designs for the stage itself, which sort of shows where Parnassus would sit, and the monastery itself would sort of fill this area around here, because it's quite a bit bigger than the internal part. The guys in Canada had created some fly-throughs of the interior, which gave us an idea of exactly what the interior dimensions would look like. So that door out there would be on the monastery itself, seen from the exterior. Everything else would be inside the big cupola. We had measurements for all of this, and it's obviously pretty important in terms of designing the thing itself. So at that point, our miniature guys, under the direction of Lee, started building the thing.
The monastery was quite a large model, but with lots and lots of detail. And as Terry saw it, he decided that he wanted to go in tighter and tighter and tighter. So it was a challenge for us to actually get the detail. It was quite a big scale, over 100 scale, so a person is tiny, tiny. And it was great, and we were particularly proud of that one.
Meanwhile, in another part of town, Vancouver actually, and we were setting up to shoot the Mr. Nick elements, which basically meant building a full-size piece of rock and finding a horse, getting Tom Waits on it. This had to be made part of the miniature, locked into the corner of it, and made part of the same camera move. So, having sort of got that far, it was important that we try and visualize with Terry what the final shot was going to look like, which would allow us to make sure the model could handle the detail and allow us to work out what sort of CG elements we needed. So one of our guys started assembling effectively fake moves. This is the stuff all sort of put together in CG with the live action dropped in. Then we started playing with camera moves. This was a sort of a very slow, majestic move in. The bird itself was a very simple bird, but it gave us some idea of what it was going to do when we eventually sort of matched it in at the end of the day. Another one was to try and come in a bit quicker, a slightly different angle. We had to get this pretty much sorted out as much as possible before the shoot, because motion control cameras are very expensive to rent, and we really only had 2 days to make all this work on the day. And at the same time, we had to work out how the eagle was going to work. First off, we built a skeleton for it to try and make sure the wing movements would make sense. This is sort of how it started life, as this sort of spindly thing flying around. Terry then came up with the idea of the long sort of bird of paradise feathers coming off it to make it look a little more interesting. And after a fairly lengthy design process, we ended up with the sort of multicolored bird of paradise that ends up in the final sequence. And alongside this, the miniature shoot had started. That involved a computer-controlled camera, making the same move again and again to create layered versions of the image. We did about, 12, 15 layers for every one, but to give you an idea, this particular move would just give us the highlights on the image itself. And this is an interesting one, actually. We started using ultraviolet lights and little dots of ultraviolet reactive paint, which you can see in there, and that was used so that we could track on the computer exactly where those points end up and add hanging flags or smoke or anything we liked at the end of the day. We'd also shoot fully lit passes, beauty passes as we call them, occasionally with fog. etc. Nicole, our cameraman, got quite inventive here. He had a very large area of plastic and smoke blowing through it so that the highlights actually had a bit of life and didn't look like they were a model. They looked like something much, much larger. And of course, all these layers had to be repeated for our hero, Mr. Nick, in the corner. This is the foreground part of the miniature that Mr. Nick would stand on, and we had to do the same process for this piece. The last thing we sort of needed when we looked at what was being shot was CG elements. There's lots of bits that it makes more sense to do as computer animation on a big miniature. Things like our moving walkway hanging, and because the walkway swings to a certain extent in the real world, it would have been impossible to make the walkway swing every time the same positions as it did, you know, on each layer. So it made sense to build that as computer animation, stick it on later. Same was true for the fog layers that were used to knock back the elephants at the bottom, and these little flame elements were used to track at various ends of the animation. So in the end, all of that, if you've followed the whole thing, was put together by a comp artist, Peter Van Hout in this case, and we ended up with the final shot that looked like this.